Her beauty became legend, but her power shaped empires. Today we explore the true story of Cleopatra. If you love deep historical stories, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Chapter 1. The World Before Cleopatra. Egypt from the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE to 100 BCE. The story of Cleopatra does not begin with her birth. It begins centuries earlier, when Egypt stood at a crossroads of civilizations, when the ancient world was reshaped by conquest, ambition, and the unstoppable rise of new empires. Long before the queen who would captivate Rome was born, the foundations of her world had already been laid by a young conqueror from Macedonia whose victories would echo across history. In the year 332 BCE, the armies of Alexander the Great marched into Egypt. The Persian Empire, which had ruled the land of the Nile for nearly 2 centuries, collapsed before him with surprising speed. To the Egyptians, Alexander did not appear as a foreign tyrant but as a liberator. The Persians had often ruled harshly, and the arrival of the Macedonian king seemed to promise something different. Alexander understood the power of symbols and legitimacy. When he entered Egypt, he paid respect to its ancient traditions and gods. He traveled deep into the western desert to the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, where priests proclaimed him the son of the god Amun. In a land where kingship was sacred and divine, this declaration was not merely religious ceremony. It was a political masterstroke. Alexander was now not simply a conqueror. In the eyes of Egypt, he was pharaoh. Yet Alexander's vision extended far beyond Egypt. His empire stretched from Greece to the edges of India, and Egypt was only one piece of his vast dominion. Still, he recognized the land's immense strategic value. Egypt controlled the fertile Nile Valley, one of the richest agricultural regions in the ancient world. It also commanded vital trade routes linking Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. To secure this position, Alexander founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast. This city would become one of the greatest centers of learning, culture, and power in the ancient world. It was called Alexandria. The location was chosen carefully. Positioned between the sea and the Nile Delta, Alexandria was perfectly suited to become a hub of trade and communication. Greek merchants, Egyptian farmers, Phoenician sailors, and scholars from across the Mediterranean would one day gather there. The city would become the beating heart of a new civilization where Greek and Egyptian traditions merged. But Alexander himself would never see what his creation became. In 323 BCE, while in Babylon, the young conqueror died suddenly at the age of 32. His empire, vast and newly forged, had no clear successor. His generals, powerful men who had fought beside him in countless battles, began to divide the empire among themselves. The world Alexander had united through conquest fractured into rival kingdoms. One of those generals would shape Egypt's future more than any other. His name was Ptolemy I Soter. Ptolemy had been one of Alexander's trusted companions, a man both shrewd and patient. When the empire began to break apart after Alexander's death, he moved quickly to secure Egypt as his own domain. Egypt was a prize unlike any other. Its natural defenses were formidable. Deserts surrounded the fertile Nile Valley, creating barriers against invasion. Its wealth, derived from the annual flooding of the Nile, ensured abundant harvests and steady taxation. For a ruler seeking stability in a chaotic world, Egypt was the perfect kingdom. Ptolemy seized control of the region and soon declared himself king. With that declaration began the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek rulers who would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Yet the Ptolemies were not Egyptians. They were Macedonian Greeks ruling an ancient land with traditions thousands of years older than their own culture. To maintain their power, they had to balance two worlds: the Hellenistic culture they brought from Greece and the deeply rooted traditions of Egyptian society. They adopted Egyptian royal customs, appearing as pharaohs in temples and participating in ancient religious ceremonies. At the same time, they preserved Greek language, education, and political institutions in their court. Alexandria became the center of this dual identity. Under the Ptolemies, the city grew rapidly into one of the most magnificent urban centers in the world. Wide avenues stretched across its carefully planned districts. Marble buildings rose beside bustling marketplaces filled with merchants from distant lands. Ships crowded the harbor, carrying grain, papyrus, glass, and spices to every corner of the Mediterranean. One structure in Alexandria soon became legendary: the Library of Alexandria. Though its exact founding remains debated among historians, it was likely established during the early reigns of the Ptolemaic kings as part of a larger institution known as the Mausoleum, a center dedicated to the Muses and the pursuit of knowledge. The ambition behind the library was extraordinary. The Ptolemies sought to gather every book in the known world. Scholars traveled from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond to study there. Works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature were collected and copied by teams of scribes. For centuries, Alexandria would stand as the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Another monument symbolized the city's importance. At the entrance to its harbor stood the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the greatest engineering achievements of antiquity. Rising high above the sea, its fire guided ships safely through the waters of the Mediterranean. Travelers approaching Egypt could see the tower from miles away. It was a beacon not only for sailors, but for the prestige of the Ptolemaic kingdom itself. For many decades, the early Ptolemaic rulers maintained a strong and prosperous state. Their navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Their wealth, fueled by Egypt's agricultural abundance, allowed them to finance armies and grand building projects. But beneath this prosperity lay growing tensions. The Ptolemies ruled as foreign monarchs over a majority Egyptian population. Greek elites occupied the highest ranks of government and military command. Meanwhile, many native Egyptians faced heavy taxation and limited political power. Revolts occasionally erupted in the countryside, reminding the rulers in Alexandria that their control was not absolute. Within the royal family itself, rivalries often turned deadly. The Ptolemaic dynasty became infamous for internal conflict. Brothers fought brothers. Sisters competed with sisters. Marriage between siblings, adopted to imitate the traditions of ancient Egyptian pharaohs, only intensified the struggle for power. Murder, exile, and betrayal became common features of royal politics. As generations passed, the dynasty gradually weakened. Meanwhile, far to the west, a new power was rising: the Roman Republic. At first, Rome seemed distant from the affairs of Egypt. But as Roman influence expanded across the Mediterranean, its shadow began to fall over the kingdoms created by Alexander's successors. Roman generals defeated one Hellenistic kingdom after another. Greece itself fell under Roman control. Asia Minor, Syria, and other regions once ruled by Alexander's heirs gradually became Roman provinces. Egypt remained independent, but its independence grew increasingly fragile. By the time the 1st century BCE approached, the Mediterranean world had changed dramatically. Rome had become the dominant military and political power of the region. Egypt still possessed immense wealth, but its rulers were weaker than their predecessors. Internal divisions and court intrigues had eroded the strength of the Ptolemaic state. Roman politicians began to see Egypt not merely as a distant kingdom, but as a valuable prize. The fertile Nile Valley produced enormous quantities of grain. Whoever controlled Egypt could influence the food supply of the Mediterranean. For Rome, whose population was rapidly growing, this resource was invaluable. Within the royal palace of Alexandria, the later Ptolemaic kings struggled to maintain authority in a world increasingly shaped by Roman power. Diplomacy, bribery, and alliances became essential tools of survival. It was into this fragile and dangerous world that Cleopatra would eventually be born. The dynasty she inherited was already unstable. Rome's influence was already looming over Egypt's future. The political games played by her ancestors had grown more ruthless with each generation. Yet Cleopatra would prove unlike any ruler who came before her. She would not simply inherit the legacy of the Ptolemies. She would fight to preserve it. And in doing so, she would become one of the most famous women in human history. But that story begins with her birth. And that moment arrives in the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Birth of Cleopatra and the Court of Ptolemy 12 Auletes, 69 BCE to 51 BCE. In the year 69 BCE, within the vast and glittering city of Alexandria, a child was born who would one day shape the fate of empires. She was born into wealth, power, and danger. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator. At the time of her birth, the kingdom of Egypt still appeared magnificent from the outside. The harbors of Alexandria remained crowded with ships arriving from across the Mediterranean. Scholars still gathered in the shadow of the great library. Temples along the Nile continued to honor gods whose worship stretched back thousands of years. Yet beneath this grandeur, the Ptolemaic dynasty was weakening. The throne of Egypt was now occupied by Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes. His nickname, Auletes, meant the flute player, a title that reflected his fondness for music but also hinted at how many people viewed him. To his critics, he seemed less like a powerful king and more like a performer trying to maintain the illusion of authority. The political situation he faced was far from simple. Egypt's wealth still made it one of the most valuable kingdoms in the Mediterranean world. Its fertile Nile Valley produced enormous harvests of grain, which were shipped across the sea to feed cities and armies. But Egypt's independence depended on delicate diplomacy with a far more powerful state, Rome. By the time Cleopatra was born, the Roman Republic had already become the dominant force in the Mediterranean. Roman generals commanded armies that dwarfed those of the Ptolemies. Roman politicians debated foreign policy in the Senate, and their decisions could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. Ptolemy XII understood that survival required Rome's favor. Maintaining that favor, however, came at a tremendous cost. Roman officials demanded vast sums of money in exchange for recognizing Ptolemy's rule. Taxes across Egypt rose sharply to finance these payments. Farmers, merchants, and craftsmen all felt the burden. The king's dependence on Rome created resentment among many Egyptians, who believed their ruler had become little more than a client of foreign powers. Within the palace of Alexandria, Cleopatra grew up surrounded by this tension. The royal court was filled with intrigue. Advisors whispered about alliances, courtiers competed for influence, and members of the royal family themselves often became rivals for the throne. Cleopatra was not an only child. She had several siblings, each of whom could potentially become an ally or an enemy. Among them were her younger brothers, including Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. She also had sisters who would one day play roles in the political struggles of the dynasty. From an early age, Cleopatra understood that royal life offered no guarantees of safety. Many rulers of the Ptolemaic line had been betrayed or murdered by their own relatives. The throne of Egypt was not simply inherited, it was fought for, defended, and sometimes stolen. Yet Cleopatra's childhood was not defined only by danger. Alexandria offered opportunities unlike any other city of the ancient world. The city itself was a remarkable blend of cultures. Greek settlers, Egyptian natives, Jewish communities, and merchants from distant lands all lived within its walls. The streets echoed with many languages, though Greek remained the language of the royal court. Cleopatra received an education worthy of a queen. Tutors instructed her in philosophy, mathematics, literature, and politics. Unlike many previous Ptolemaic rulers, she also learned the Egyptian language itself. This may seem like a simple detail, but it marked a profound difference. Most members of the Ptolemaic dynasty spoke only Greek and relied on translators when dealing with their Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra, however, chose to learn the language of the land she ruled. Ancient writers later claimed she could speak many languages, perhaps as many as 9. Whether that number was exaggerated or not, it is clear that Cleopatra possessed an exceptional intellect and a remarkable talent for communication. She studied the history of Egypt, the traditions of its temples, and the complex politics of the Mediterranean world. She also observed the behavior of her father's court, learning how power was gained and lost. These lessons would later prove vital. But during Cleopatra's youth, her father faced a crisis that nearly cost him the throne. In 58 BCE, unrest erupted across Egypt. The heavy taxes required to satisfy Rome had angered many citizens. At the same time, Ptolemy XII had failed to intervene when Rome annexed the nearby island kingdom of Cyprus, which had been ruled by one of his relatives. Many Egyptians viewed this as weakness. Protests in Alexandria escalated into a revolt. Facing growing hostility, Ptolemy XII fled the country. He traveled to Rome, hoping to secure military assistance to regain his throne. For several years, Egypt was ruled by Cleopatra's older sister, Berenice IV. Berenice attempted to establish herself as queen, but the balance of power in the Mediterranean no longer favored independent rulers who lacked Roman approval. Ptolemy XII spent enormous sums bribing Roman politicians to support his restoration. Eventually, his efforts succeeded. In 55 BCE, a Roman force led by the general Aulus Gabinius marched into Egypt and reinstated him as king. The restoration came with consequences. Berenice IV was captured and executed for her rebellion. Roman soldiers remained stationed in Egypt to support the king's authority, and the financial debts Ptolemy owed to Roman allies grew even larger. For Cleopatra, who was still a young woman during these events, the lesson was unmistakable. Rome had become the ultimate arbiter of power. A ruler could not survive without understanding Roman politics and forming alliances with its leaders. As Cleopatra grew older, she became increasingly involved in the affairs of the royal court. She observed diplomats arriving from foreign kingdoms. She listened as advisors discussed Roman generals and Senate debates. The Roman Republic itself was entering a period of intense turmoil. Powerful figures such as Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus dominated the political landscape. Their rivalries and alliances would soon lead Rome into civil war, and Egypt would inevitably be drawn into that conflict. By the early 50s BCE, Ptolemy XII's health was declining. Years of political struggle and financial pressure had taken their toll. The king began preparing for the succession. According to his will, Cleopatra was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Such arrangements were common in the Ptolemaic dynasty. Brother and sister would marry and govern together as king and queen, following a tradition that echoed the ancient Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris. Yet these arrangements often led to rivalry rather than harmony. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was around 18 years old. Her brother Ptolemy XIII was only a child. In theory, they would rule Egypt together. In reality, a struggle for control was about to begin. Within the palace walls of Alexandria, powerful advisors and courtiers quickly aligned themselves with the young king. They believed Cleopatra, intelligent and ambitious, might attempt to dominate the throne. And they were right. Cleopatra had no intention of remaining a passive co-ruler. The political storm that followed would soon drive her from the throne, force her into exile, and ultimately lead her to an alliance with one of the most powerful men in Roman history. That man was Julius Caesar. Their meeting would change the course of history. But before that moment arrived, Cleopatra would first have to fight for her survival. Chapter 3. Cleopatra and the Struggle for the Throne, 51 BCE to 48 BCE. When Ptolemy XII Auletes died in 51 BCE, the throne of Egypt passed according to his will to two young rulers. His daughter, Cleopatra VII Philopator, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, were to rule together as queen and king. This arrangement followed a long-standing tradition within the Ptolemaic dynasty. Royal siblings married one another and shared the throne, presenting themselves to the Egyptian people as divine rulers, much like the ancient gods Isis and Osiris. On papyrus documents and temple inscriptions, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII appeared as partners in power. But the appearance of unity concealed a dangerous reality. Cleopatra was about 18 years old when her father died. Ptolemy XIII was still a boy, perhaps 10 years old. In practice, this meant that the young king would rely heavily on advisors who would govern in his name. Three powerful figures quickly emerged at the center of his court. The first was Pothinus, a palace official who served as the king's guardian and regent. The second was Achilles, commander of the royal army. The third was Theodotus of Chios, a Greek scholar who had become one of the young king's political counselors. Together, these men formed a powerful faction within the palace of Alexandria. From their perspective, Cleopatra represented a threat. Unlike her brother, she was an adult and capable of ruling independently. She had already demonstrated intelligence, ambition, and political awareness. If she gained full control of the government, the influence of Pothinus and his allies would likely disappear. At first, Cleopatra attempted to rule jointly with her brother as tradition required. Official documents from the early years of their reign listed both names as rulers of Egypt. But Cleopatra soon began taking steps that revealed her intentions. Gradually, her brother's name began disappearing from certain royal decrees. Cleopatra issued orders in her own authority. Coins were minted bearing her image alone. Even more strikingly, she appeared without her brother during important state ceremonies. These actions were unprecedented within the Ptolemaic dynasty. They signaled that Cleopatra did not intend to remain a symbolic co-ruler. She intended to govern Egypt herself. For Pothinus and the advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII, this was unacceptable. By 49 BCE, the struggle for power had become open and unmistakable. The royal court divided into rival factions. Some officials supported Cleopatra, believing her intelligence and experience made her the stronger ruler. Others backed the young king and the advisors who controlled him. The tension grew steadily worse. Eventually, Cleopatra lost control of the palace. The exact details remain uncertain, but by 48 BCE Cleopatra had been forced to leave Alexandria. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII had effectively staged a political coup, removing her from power and declaring the young king the sole ruler of Egypt. For many rulers, such a defeat would have meant the end. But Cleopatra was not finished. She fled eastward across the Sinai Peninsula, seeking refuge in the territories beyond Egypt's borders. There, far from the royal palace that had once been her home, she began gathering supporters. Her goal was simple. She intended to reclaim her throne. The region east of Egypt offered opportunities for recruiting allies and soldiers. Mercenaries were common throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and many were willing to fight for the right price. Cleopatra began assembling an army. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, the advisors of Ptolemy XIII attempted to consolidate their control. They presented the young king as the rightful ruler and portrayed Cleopatra as a rebellious sister who had threatened the stability of the kingdom. But their victory was far from secure. Cleopatra's growing army represented a direct challenge to their authority. Before the two sides could settle their conflict on the battlefield, events elsewhere in the Mediterranean dramatically changed the situation. The Roman Republic was descending into civil war. Two of Rome's most powerful leaders, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, had become rivals for supreme power. Their struggle divided Rome and its territories, drawing armies and allies into a massive conflict. The war reached a decisive turning point in 48 BCE. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar defeated Pompey's forces in Greece. Pompey fled the battlefield, searching desperately for refuge. There were only a few places left where a defeated Roman leader might seek safety. One of them was Egypt. Pompey had once helped restore Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, to the throne years earlier. Because of this past connection, he believed Egypt might offer protection. In the autumn of 48 BCE, Pompey sailed toward Alexandria. His arrival created a dilemma for the advisors governing in the name of Ptolemy XIII. Supporting Pompey could anger Caesar, who now held the advantage in the Roman civil war, but rejecting Pompey might appear ungrateful to a former ally. The advisors made a brutal decision. As Pompey approached the Egyptian shore, he was invited to meet representatives of the king. Believing he was about to receive assistance, the Roman general stepped into a small boat that carried him toward land. Instead of welcome, he found betrayal. Agents of Ptolemy XIII murdered Pompey before he could even step onto Egyptian soil. His severed head was later presented to Caesar as a supposed gift, a gesture intended to demonstrate loyalty to the victorious Roman leader. But the plan backfired. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly afterward, he was reportedly horrified by the murder of his former ally and rival. Though Pompey had been his enemy, he had once been one of Rome's greatest generals. The killing appeared not as loyalty, but as treachery. Caesar now found himself drawn into the political crisis of Egypt. Two rival rulers claimed the throne, Ptolemy XIII in Alexandria and Cleopatra gathering forces beyond Egypt's borders. As a Roman leader with immense authority, Caesar believed he had the right to mediate the dispute. But Cleopatra saw a greater opportunity. If she could win Caesar's support, she might regain her throne without needing to defeat her brother's army alone. The problem was reaching him. Alexandria was controlled by the supporters of Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra could not simply walk into the city without risking capture or death. Yet she was willing to attempt something bold. According to ancient accounts, Cleopatra secretly entered Alexandria and managed to meet Caesar in private. One famous story claims she was smuggled into the palace wrapped in a carpet or bundle of bedding, carried by a loyal servant. Whether this dramatic detail is completely accurate or somewhat embellished by later writers remains debated. What is certain is that Cleopatra successfully gained an audience with the most powerful Roman in the Mediterranean. And when she stood before him, the future of Egypt began to change. Her intelligence, charisma, and political skill quickly made an impression. Caesar now faced a choice. He could support the young king controlled by palace advisors, or he could support Cleopatra, the ambitious queen determined to reclaim her throne. His decision would ignite a war inside the streets of Alexandria itself. And that war would determine whether Cleopatra would remain an exiled princess or rise again as Queen of Egypt. Chapter 4. The arrival of Caesar in Alexandria, 48 BCE to 47 BCE. In the autumn of 48 BCE, the political storm that had been building across the Mediterranean finally reached the shores of Egypt. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in civil war, and the consequences of that conflict would soon engulf the kingdom of the Nile. The central figure in this unfolding drama was Julius Caesar. Only weeks earlier, Caesar had achieved one of the most decisive victories of his career. At the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, his army had defeated the forces of his rival, Pompey the Great. Pompey had once been one of the most powerful men in Rome. For years, he had dominated Roman politics and commanded vast armies. But after the defeat at Pharsalus, his position collapsed almost overnight. With his army shattered, Pompey fled eastward, seeking allies who might still support him. His journey eventually led him to the shores of Egypt, where he believed he might find protection. The kingdom was ruled in theory by the young king Ptolemy XIII, though real power lay in the hands of his advisors. Among them were the regent Pothinus and the general Achillas. These men understood the danger of the situation. Supporting Pompey could anger Caesar, who had just won a major victory, but rejecting Pompey might offend a man who had once helped restore Egypt's former king to power. After debating their options, the advisors chose a ruthless solution. When Pompey's ship anchored near the coast of Egypt, he was invited to come ashore to meet representatives of the king. Trusting that he would be welcomed, Pompey stepped into a small boat that carried him toward land. Instead of greeting him with honor, the Egyptians murdered him. Pompey was stabbed to death before he could even reach the shore. His head was severed and preserved, intended as a gift for Caesar when he arrived. The advisors believed they had made a clever political move. They believed Caesar would be grateful. They were wrong. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly afterward, he was presented with Pompey's head as proof of loyalty. Instead of satisfaction, Caesar reportedly reacted with anger and disgust. Pompey had been his enemy in the Civil War, but he had also once been his ally and son-in-law. More importantly, the murder of a Roman consul and general by foreign agents was a shocking act that threatened Roman dignity. Caesar ordered Pompey's remains to be buried with proper honors. But his arrival in Egypt had already entangled him in the kingdom's political crisis. At that moment, two rival rulers claimed authority over Egypt. In Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII sat on the throne under the influence of his advisors. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of Egypt, Cleopatra VII Philopator was gathering forces in preparation to reclaim her crown. Caesar believed he had the authority to settle the dispute. Egypt was technically an independent kingdom, but it had long relied on Roman support to maintain stability. Caesar also possessed a copy of the will of Cleopatra's father, which stated that Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were meant to rule together. From Caesar's perspective, the solution seemed simple. Both siblings should govern jointly, as their father had intended. But the political situation in Alexandria was far more complicated. The advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII feared losing their influence if Cleopatra returned to power. They had spent years strengthening their control over the young king. A reconciliation between the siblings would weaken their position dramatically. Meanwhile, Cleopatra understood that Caesar's presence represented an extraordinary opportunity. If she could secure his support, she could regain the throne without fighting her brother's army alone. The challenge was reaching him. Alexandria was under the control of Ptolemy XIII and his advisors. Cleopatra could not simply enter the city openly. Doing so would risk immediate capture or assassination. Instead, she attempted something daring. According to the most famous story recorded by ancient writers, Cleopatra secretly entered Alexandria under cover of night. Accompanied by a loyal servant, she managed to reach Caesar's residence inside the royal palace. To avoid detection, She was reportedly hidden inside a bundle of bedding or rolled inside a carpet that was carried into the palace as a gift. When the bundle was opened, Cleopatra emerged before Caesar himself. Whether every detail of this story is completely accurate remains uncertain, but it captures something important about Cleopatra's character. She was bold, theatrical, and willing to take enormous risks. Her meeting with Caesar changed everything. Cleopatra was not simply beautiful, as later legends would claim. Ancient writers emphasized her intelligence, charm, and extraordinary ability to persuade others. She spoke with confidence about the situation in Egypt. She explained how her brother's advisors had forced her into exile and how they now controlled the kingdom. Caesar listened carefully. For him, supporting Cleopatra offered several advantages. She appeared capable and politically astute. She also seemed far more likely to cooperate with Roman interests than the unpredictable advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII. Before long, Caesar announced that he intended to settle the dispute between the siblings according to their father's will. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII would rule together. But this decision outraged the faction controlling the young king. Pothinus and his allies realized that Caesar's presence threatened their entire position. If Cleopatra returned to power, their influence would vanish. They began preparing for resistance. Meanwhile, Caesar found himself in a difficult position. He had arrived in Alexandria with only a relatively small force of Roman soldiers. His main army remained elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. At first, he believed his authority as a Roman consul would be enough to enforce his decision. But events soon proved otherwise. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII secretly ordered the Egyptian army to march on Alexandria. The commander of these forces was the general Achilles. Within a short time, thousands of soldiers loyal to the young king surrounded the city. What had begun as a diplomatic mission was rapidly becoming a war. The conflict that followed would be known as the Alexandrian War. Streets, palaces, and harbors of one of the greatest cities of the ancient world would become battlegrounds. Caesar and Cleopatra now found themselves allies in a desperate struggle. The stakes were enormous. If Caesar lost, his authority in the Roman world would be shattered. If Cleopatra lost, she would almost certainly be killed. Inside the royal palace of Alexandria, the two leaders prepared for the coming fight. Armies were gathering. The city was on the edge of chaos, and the fate of Egypt was about to be decided in battle. Chapter 5. Cleopatra and Caesar, Alliance, Power, and the Birth of a Dynasty. 47 BCE to 44 BCE. The war that erupted in Alexandria during 48 BCE quickly transformed the city from a center of culture into a battlefield. Streets that once echoed with the voices of merchants and scholars now filled with the sounds of soldiers and siege engines. At the center of the conflict stood two allies whose partnership would shape the fate of Egypt and influence the future of Rome itself. One was Cleopatra VII Philopator. The other was Julius Caesar. Caesar had arrived in Egypt intending to resolve a political dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. But the situation quickly spiraled into open warfare when the king's advisors rejected Caesar's authority and ordered their army to attack. The commander of those forces, Achilles, marched into Alexandria with thousands of soldiers. Caesar, by contrast, had only a few thousand Roman troops with him. Though they were experienced veterans, they were vastly outnumbered. The Roman general realized that retreat was impossible. If he abandoned Alexandria, Cleopatra's cause would collapse and Rome's prestige would suffer. Instead, he chose to hold the royal quarter of the city and wait for reinforcements. Thus began the Alexandrian War. For months, fierce fighting raged throughout parts of the city. Caesar's soldiers fortified their position around the royal palace and the harbor. Control of the harbor was especially important because it allowed Roman ships to receive supplies and reinforcements from the sea. At one point during the struggle, Caesar ordered Egyptian ships in the harbor to be burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The fire spread across the docks and warehouses. Some ancient writers later suggested that the flames may have damaged portions of the famous Library of Alexandria, though the full extent of the destruction remains uncertain. While the battle unfolded, Cleopatra remained within the palace alongside Caesar. Far from being a passive observer, she played an active role in the political drama surrounding the conflict. Her presence reinforced Caesar's claim that he was defending the legitimate ruler of Egypt. Meanwhile, the court faction supporting Ptolemy XIII began to collapse from internal tensions. The regent Pothinus was discovered secretly communicating with enemy forces outside the palace. Caesar responded swiftly. Pothinus was executed for treason. Another dramatic moment came when Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, escaped from the palace and joined the Egyptian army opposing Caesar. Arsinoe declared herself queen and attempted to rally Egyptian resistance against the Roman presence. Her supporters hoped she might replace both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as ruler. The conflict within the royal family had now grown even more complicated. For Caesar, however, the primary goal remained survival and victory. Reinforcements were eventually dispatched from Roman territories in the eastern Mediterranean. When these forces finally approached Egypt in early 47 BCE, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Caesar marched out of Alexandria to confront the army of Ptolemy XIII near the Nile. The battle that followed ended in disaster for the young king's forces. During the chaotic retreat that followed the Roman victory, Ptolemy XIII attempted to escape across the river. His boat capsized, and the young king drowned in the Nile. With his death, the immediate challenge to Cleopatra's rule disappeared. Arsinoe IV was captured soon afterward and taken prisoner by Caesar. She would later be transported to Rome and displayed as a captive during one of Caesar's triumphal celebrations. The Alexandrian War was over. Cleopatra had regained her throne. Yet the new political arrangement that followed still reflected the traditions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra was formally declared queen alongside another brother, Ptolemy XIV. As before, the siblings were married according to royal custom and ruled jointly in theory. In practice, however, Cleopatra held the real power. Her alliance with Caesar had secured her position. Roman influence remained strong in Egypt, and the queen understood the importance of maintaining that relationship. The partnership between Cleopatra and Caesar soon became more personal as well as political. During Caesar's stay in Egypt, the two became lovers. Ancient sources describe a period of celebration and travel after the war ended. One famous story recounts a journey along the Nile, where Cleopatra reportedly hosted Caesar aboard a luxurious royal barge. These stories, whether embellished or not, illustrate how their alliance extended beyond diplomacy. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. The child was named Ptolemy XV Caesar, though he became widely known as Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Cleopatra believed this child represented the union of Egyptian and Roman power. If Caesar recognized the boy as his heir, the political implications could be enormous. But Roman society was complicated and deeply traditional. Caesar already had an adopted heir in Rome, and acknowledging a foreign-born son might provoke controversy. Nevertheless, Cleopatra openly presented Caesarion as Caesar's child. The birth strengthened Cleopatra's connection to Rome's most powerful man. After securing Egypt, Caesar eventually returned to Rome in 46 BCE. His victories in the Civil War had made him the dominant figure in Roman politics. He was appointed dictator and began implementing sweeping reforms across the Roman world. Not long after, Cleopatra herself traveled to Rome. She did not come as a prisoner or subordinate ruler. Instead, she arrived as an allied monarch whose kingdom played an important role in Rome's economy and diplomacy. During her stay, Cleopatra lived in a villa provided by Caesar on the outskirts of the city. Her presence fascinated and disturbed many Romans. The idea that a foreign queen had gained such influence over Caesar sparked rumors and political tensions. Some Romans feared that Caesar might even attempt to establish a monarchy modeled on Eastern traditions. In the Roman Republic, the very idea of kingship was deeply unpopular. Despite these controversies, Cleopatra remained in Rome for several years. Then in 44 BCE, a shocking event changed everything. On a day that would become infamous in history, a group of Roman senators assassinated Julius Caesar inside the Senate House. The murder plunged Rome once again into chaos. For Cleopatra, the consequences were immediate and dangerous. Without Caesar's protection, her position in Rome became uncertain. The political factions that had opposed Caesar might now view her as a symbol of his influence. Recognizing the danger, Cleopatra quickly left Rome and returned to Egypt. Back in Alexandria, she faced new challenges. Her brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, died not long afterward under mysterious circumstances. Some historians believe Cleopatra may have arranged his death to eliminate potential rivals. Soon after, she declared her young son Caesarion as her new co-ruler. The child now became Ptolemy XV Caesar, king of Egypt alongside his mother. But the Roman world remained unstable. The assassination of Caesar had triggered another power struggle, this time between his supporters and the men who had plotted his death. One of the leaders emerging from this chaos would soon enter Cleopatra's life. His name was Mark Antony, and their alliance would soon become one of the most famous relationships in history. Chapter 6. Roman Chaos and the Rise of Mark Antony. 44 BCE to 41 BCE. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. The Roman Republic, already strained by years of civil war, now plunged once again into uncertainty and violence. For Cleopatra VII Philopator, the consequences were immediate. She had been living in Rome under Caesar's protection when he was murdered. With his death, the political landscape changed overnight. The conspirators who carried out the assassination believed they had saved the Roman Republic. Led by senators such as Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, they claimed they had acted to prevent Caesar from becoming a tyrant. But instead of restoring stability, the murder unleashed new rivalries for power. Cleopatra quickly realized that remaining in Rome had become dangerous. Without Caesar to protect her, she was a foreign queen surrounded by uncertain allies and potential enemies. Within a short time, she departed Italy and sailed back to Egypt. When she returned to Alexandria, she resumed her position as ruler of the kingdom. At her side was her young son, Ptolemy XV Caesar. Cleopatra declared the child her co-ruler. To her, Caesarion represented more than a prince. He symbolized the connection between Egypt and the legacy of Caesar himself. Yet the queen understood that her survival depended on events unfolding far beyond the Nile. The Roman world was reorganizing itself after Caesar's death. One of the most powerful figures in this new struggle was Mark Antony. Antony had been one of Caesar's most trusted commanders. A skilled soldier and charismatic leader, he had fought beside Caesar in many campaigns. When news of the assassination spread through Rome, Antony initially found himself in a precarious position. The conspirators hoped that removing Caesar would weaken his supporters. But Antony quickly proved that the political situation was far from simple. At Caesar's funeral, Antony delivered a powerful speech to the Roman people. Ancient accounts describe how he displayed Caesar's blood-stained clothing and recounted the achievements of the fallen leader. The speech stirred anger among the crowd and helped turn public opinion against the assassins. Soon Rome descended into unrest. The conspirators fled the city, while Caesar's allies began organizing their own forces. Yet another figure soon emerged as a contender for power. This man was Augustus. At the time, he was still a young man known as Octavian, the adopted son and heir named in Caesar's will. Though only in his late teens, Octavian possessed remarkable political instincts. He quickly began gathering supporters among Caesar's former soldiers and allies. For a time, tensions between Antony and Octavian threatened to spark another civil war. But eventually, a temporary alliance formed. In 43 BCE, Antony, Octavian, and another Roman leader named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus created a political arrangement known as the Second Triumvirate. This alliance granted the three men extraordinary powers to rule the Roman state and pursue the enemies of Caesar. Their first objective was revenge. The forces of the triumvirs marched east to confront the armies of Brutus and Cassius, the leading conspirators in Caesar's assassination. The conflict reached its climax in 42 BCE at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. The armies of Antony and Octavian emerged victorious. Both Brutus and Cassius died after the defeat, bringing an end to the main resistance against Caesar's supporters. With their enemies defeated, the triumvirs divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian took control of the western territories, including Italy and Gaul. Lepidus received parts of North Africa. Antony assumed authority over the eastern provinces of the Roman sphere. This division of power had enormous consequences for Egypt. Because Antony now governed the eastern Mediterranean, he effectively became the Roman leader responsible for dealing with kingdoms such as Cleopatra's Egypt. Meanwhile, Cleopatra had spent the years after Caesar's death consolidating her authority at home. One of the most controversial events during this period was the sudden death of her brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV. Ancient writers suggested that Cleopatra may have arranged his death to eliminate a potential rival and secure the throne for her son Caesarion. Whether this accusation was true or the result of later rumors remains uncertain, but the outcome was clear. Caesarion now ruled alongside his mother as king of Egypt. As Cleopatra strengthened her position, the new Roman authorities began reviewing the loyalties of Eastern rulers during the recent civil wars. Many leaders had supported one Roman faction or another. Antony demanded that regional rulers appear before him to explain their actions. In 41 BCE, he summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in southern Anatolia. The invitation was both a command and a test. Antony wanted to know whether Cleopatra had supported Caesar's enemies during the Roman Civil War. Some reports suggested she had delayed sending aid to one of his allies. If Antony decided she had acted against Roman interests, her kingdom could face severe consequences. But Cleopatra understood the nature of power. Years earlier, she had impressed Caesar with her intelligence and boldness. Now she would attempt something similar with the man who had inherited authority over Rome's eastern world. The meeting between Cleopatra and Mark Antony soon became one of the most famous encounters in ancient history. Cleopatra did not arrive quietly. Ancient writers describe her journey to Tarsus as a display of breathtaking luxury and theatrical brilliance. Her ship reportedly sailed along the river with purple sails and silver oars. Musicians played as the vessel approached the city, while perfumes filled the air. Cleopatra herself appeared dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants portraying divine companions. Whether every detail of this scene was exaggerated by later historians is uncertain, but it reveals something about Cleopatra's strategy. She understood the power of spectacle. When Antony finally met the Queen of Egypt, he encountered not merely a ruler seeking favor, but a woman who projected confidence, intelligence, and wealth on a scale few others could match. Their conversation began with politics. Antony questioned Cleopatra about Egypt's actions during the Roman Civil War. Cleopatra defended herself skillfully, explaining that circumstances had prevented her from providing earlier support. But the meeting soon evolved into something more complex. Antony, like Caesar before him, found Cleopatra captivating. Before long, the Roman general accepted her invitation to visit Egypt. In the months that followed, their political alliance would transform into one of the most famous romantic relationships of the ancient world. And together, Cleopatra and Mark Antony would soon challenge the power of Rome itself. Chapter 7. Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the alliance that shook the Mediterranean. 41 BCE to 34 BCE. When Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra VII Philopator to meet him in the city of Tarsus in 41 BCE, neither of them could fully predict how their alliance would reshape the politics of the Mediterranean world. The Roman Republic was still recovering from the assassination of Julius Caesar. In the years that followed, the Second Triumvirate, formed by Antony, Augustus, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, had divided authority over the Roman world. Antony had taken responsibility for the eastern provinces. This region included wealthy territories stretching from Greece to Syria, as well as powerful client kingdoms like Egypt. For Cleopatra, the meeting with Antony represented both danger and opportunity. Egypt's independence had always depended on maintaining good relations with Rome. Cleopatra had previously secured her throne with the help of Caesar. Now Caesar was gone, and a new Roman power had risen in the east. If Antony turned against her, Egypt might fall under direct Roman control. But if she could win his trust, and perhaps more than his trust, Egypt could remain strong and influential. Cleopatra arrived in Tarsus with a display that ancient writers never forgot. Her ship glided along the river with brilliant decorations, musicians, and attendants surrounding the queen like a living symbol of divine luxury. When Antony met her, he encountered not a submissive ruler but a confident monarch who understood politics as well as spectacle. Their conversations quickly extended beyond diplomatic matters. Cleopatra entertained Antony with banquets, discussions, and elaborate displays of Egyptian wealth and culture. By the time the meeting ended, Antony accepted her invitation to visit Egypt. Soon afterward, he traveled to Alexandria. For the Roman general, Alexandria was unlike any city he had known. Its vast harbor welcomed ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. Its streets blended Greek architecture with Egyptian temples thousands of years old. Its markets were filled with goods from Africa, Arabia, and Asia. Cleopatra welcomed Antony with extraordinary hospitality. Ancient sources describe months of celebration in Alexandria. Banquets, performances, and lavish feasts became part of their shared life in the city. Some writers even claim the pair formed a group called the Inimitable Livers, devoted to extravagant entertainment. But beneath the luxury, serious political discussions were taking place. Antony needed resources. The eastern provinces of Rome required military campaigns to secure their borders. One of Antony's major goals was preparing a campaign against the powerful Parthian Empire, Rome's long-standing rival in the east. Such an expedition would require enormous financial support. Egypt was one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world. Its grain harvests and treasury could provide the funds Antony needed. For Cleopatra, Supporting Antony offered advantages as well. In exchange for her assistance, Antony could strengthen Egypt's position in the region and restore territories that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic kingdom. Their alliance quickly became both political and personal. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins. The children were named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The names themselves reflected Cleopatra's ambitions. Helios meant sun, and Selene meant moon, symbols suggesting cosmic power and royal destiny. Yet Antony could not remain in Egypt indefinitely. Events in Rome demanded his attention. Tensions had developed between Antony and his fellow triumvir, Octavian. The fragile alliance between them required careful negotiation to prevent another civil war. In 40 BCE, Antony returned to Italy and eventually married Octavian's sister, Octavia Minor. This marriage was intended to strengthen the political bond between the two Roman leaders. For several years, Antony remained mostly in the Roman world, organizing his eastern provinces and preparing for military campaigns. Cleopatra continued ruling Egypt, maintaining stability in her kingdom while waiting to see how the political balance in Rome would evolve. Eventually, Antony returned to the east in 37 BCE. This time, his relationship with Cleopatra deepened dramatically. The Roman leader once again visited Alexandria, and the two resumed their alliance. Cleopatra provided financial support for Antony's planned campaign against the Parthian Empire. But the campaign ended in disappointment. Antony's invasion of Parthian territory faced logistical difficulties, harsh terrain, and determined resistance. The Roman army suffered heavy losses and eventually retreated. The failed campaign damaged Antony's reputation in Rome. Yet Cleopatra remained one of his strongest supporters. In the years that followed, Antony began reshaping the political map of the eastern Mediterranean with Cleopatra's cooperation. In 34 BCE, after another successful campaign in Armenia, Antony organized a grand ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria. During this event, territories under Roman influence were distributed among Cleopatra and her children. Cleopatra herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings, while her son with Caesar, Ptolemy 15 Caesar, was recognized as King of Kings. Cleopatra's children with Antony also received symbolic realms to rule in the future. To Cleopatra, the ceremony represented the revival of a great Eastern empire centered on Egypt. But in Rome, the reaction was explosive. Octavian and his supporters portrayed Antony's actions as a betrayal of Roman interests. They argued that Antony had fallen under the influence of a foreign queen and was dividing Roman territories among her children. The political rivalry between Antony and Octavian now moved steadily toward open conflict. For Cleopatra, the stakes were enormous. Her alliance with Antony had strengthened Egypt and expanded its influence, but it had also made her the target of Roman hostility. The tension between the two Roman leaders would soon erupt into the final and decisive struggle for control of the Roman world. And when that war began, Cleopatra and Antony would face their greatest challenge together. Chapter 8. The Road to War with Octavian. 34 BCE to 31 BCE. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the alliance between Cleopatra's 7 Philopator and Mark Antony had grown into one of the most powerful political partnerships in the Mediterranean world. Yet that same alliance was now pushing the Roman Republic toward its final and decisive civil war. The tension centered on Antony's rival in Rome, Augustus. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, the Roman world had been divided among the leaders of the Second Triumvirate. Antony ruled the eastern territories, Octavian governed the western regions, and a third leader, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, controlled parts of North Africa. But this arrangement was never meant to last forever. Rivalry between Antony and Octavian had been growing steadily for years. Each man commanded armies and controlled vast resources. Each also claimed to be the true defender of Caesar's legacy. The balance of power began shifting after 36 BCE, when Octavian forced Lepidus out of the triumvirate and absorbed his territories. This left Antony and Octavian as the two dominant figures in the Roman world. Meanwhile, Antony's connection with Cleopatra was becoming deeper and more controversial. Though Antony had once married Octavian's sister, Octavia Minor, the marriage had become largely political. Octavia had helped maintain peace between the two Roman leaders for several years. But as Antony spent more time in the eastern Mediterranean with Cleopatra, the relationship with Octavia weakened. Eventually, Antony sent Octavia back to Rome, effectively ending their marriage. In Roman society, this decision caused outrage. Octavia was widely respected and admired. By rejecting her and continuing his relationship with Cleopatra, Antony appeared to many Romans as though he was abandoning Roman traditions in favor of a foreign queen. Octavian understood the political opportunity this created. He began launching a campaign of propaganda against Antony. Roman poets, politicians, and public speakers spread stories portraying Antony as a man who had fallen under Cleopatra's influence. According to this narrative, Cleopatra was manipulating Antony in order to control Rome itself. These accusations were exaggerated, but they proved effective. Many Romans feared the idea of Eastern monarchies and foreign rulers interfering in Roman politics. Octavian's supporters painted Cleopatra as a dangerous and seductive queen determined to dominate the Roman world. The situation worsened dramatically after a famous ceremony in Alexandria. In 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra organized a massive public event now remembered as the Donations of Alexandria. The ceremony took place in the grand capital of Alexandria. Thousands gathered to witness the spectacle as Antony and Cleopatra appeared seated on golden thrones before the crowd. During the event, Antony distributed territories across the eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and her children. Cleopatra herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings. Her son with Caesar, Ptolemy 15 Caesar, was declared King of Kings and recognized as the legitimate heir of Caesar. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's children with Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were symbolically assigned rule over various eastern territories. To Cleopatra, the ceremony represented the rebirth of a powerful Eastern empire centered on Egypt. But in Rome, the reaction was furious. Octavian's supporters claimed Antony had gone too far. They argued that Roman lands were being handed over to a foreign queen and her children. Even more alarming to them was Antony's recognition of Caesarion as the son and heir of Julius Caesar. If Caesarion were truly Caesar's legitimate son, it could undermine Octavian's own claim to be Caesar's rightful successor. Octavian seized upon this issue with determination. Using political influence in Rome, he publicly attacked Antony's decisions. He presented himself as the defender of Roman traditions against Eastern luxury and monarchy. At one point, Octavian reportedly obtained Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and read it aloud before the Roman Senate. According to Octavian's account, the will contained shocking provisions. Antony allegedly planned to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome, and he recognized Cleopatra's children as heirs to vast territories. Whether these claims were entirely accurate remains debated among historians, but they had a powerful effect on Roman public opinion. Gradually, the Roman political conflict began transforming into a personal and ideological struggle. Octavian carefully framed the coming war not as a civil war between Romans, but as a defensive campaign against a foreign queen. Instead of declaring war on Antony directly, Rome declared war on Cleopatra. This strategy allowed Octavian to portray himself as protecting Rome from an Eastern monarch who threatened its independence. Meanwhile, Cleopatra and Antony began preparing for the inevitable conflict. Egypt's wealth allowed them to assemble enormous military resources. Their forces included Roman legions loyal to Antony, as well as Egyptian ships and soldiers. The eastern Mediterranean became a stage for military preparation. Fleets gathered in harbors, armies marched across provinces, and alliances were formed with regional rulers. By 31 BCE, the final confrontation between the two sides was approaching. Octavian's fleet and army advanced toward Greece, where Antony had concentrated his forces. Cleopatra also brought a powerful Egyptian fleet to support the campaign. The stage was set for one of the most decisive naval battles in ancient history. The outcome of that battle would determine the fate of the Roman world. It would also decide whether Cleopatra's dream of preserving Egypt's independence could survive the rising power of Rome. That decisive clash would take place at a location that would become famous across history. The Battle of Actium. Chapter 9. The battle that changed the world. 31 BCE. By the year 31 BCE, the long rivalry between Mark Antony and Augustus had reached its final and decisive stage. For years, tension had been building between the two leaders. Political propaganda, broken alliances, and competing ambitions had pushed the Roman world toward war. Now the conflict could no longer be avoided. At the center of the struggle stood Cleopatra VII Philopator. Her alliance with Antony had made Egypt a powerful partner in the eastern Mediterranean, but it had also made her the target of Octavian's political campaign. Rome had formally declared war on Cleopatra. Yet in reality, the war was a contest for control of the entire Roman world. Both sides began gathering their forces across the eastern Mediterranean. Antony and Cleopatra assembled their army and fleet in Greece, hoping to block Octavian's advance and protect the eastern territories under their influence. Octavian, meanwhile, moved steadily eastward with his own fleet and army. His most important commander was the brilliant Admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, whose skill at naval warfare would prove decisive in the coming conflict. The confrontation between the two sides would occur near the western coast of Greece, close to a narrow gulf known as Actium. In ancient times, this location controlled access to the Ambracian Gulf and served as an important strategic point along the coastline. During the summer of 31 BCE, the fleets of Antony and Octavian faced each other across these waters, preparing for battle. Antony commanded a massive fleet of heavy warships. These vessels were large and powerful, designed to crush enemy ships with reinforced hulls and towering decks filled with soldiers. Cleopatra's Egyptian fleet also formed an important part of Antony's naval force. Her ships were known for their strength and their experienced crews. Altogether, Antony's fleet may have included more than 200 ships, supported by tens of thousands of soldiers stationed on nearby land. Yet despite the size of his forces, Antony faced serious problems. Many of his troops had grown tired after years of campaigning. Disease spread through the camps, weakening the army. Supplies became increasingly difficult to maintain as Octavian's forces tightened their control over surrounding territories. Agrippa's fleet also proved extremely effective at disrupting Antony's supply lines. Over time, Antony's strategic position deteriorated. Cleopatra, observing the situation carefully, began to recognize the danger. If Antony's forces remained trapped in Greece, they could eventually be destroyed or forced to surrender. One possible solution remained: They could attempt to break through Octavian's blockade and sail back to Egypt. Such a maneuver would be extremely risky, but it might preserve their remaining strength. Eventually, Antony agreed to attempt a naval breakout. On a warm morning in early September of 31 BCE, the two fleets prepared for battle near the coast of Actium. The sea was calm as the massive ships began moving into formation. Octavian's fleet, commanded largely by Agrippa, consisted of smaller and more maneuverable vessels. These ships could move quickly and attack the slower, heavier ships of Antony's fleet from multiple directions. Antony's ships, though powerful, were less agile. Their strategy depended on using their size and strength to overwhelm opponents in close combat. As the battle began, the two fleets clashed across the water. Ships rammed into one another with reinforced bronze prows. Soldiers hurled spears and arrows across the decks. Boarding parties attempted to capture enemy vessels in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fighting stretched across the sea in a chaotic struggle of oars, sails, and weapons. For hours, neither side achieved a decisive advantage. But the balance slowly began to shift. Agrippa's more maneuverable ships started isolating sections of Antony's fleet, surrounding individual vessels and attacking them from several sides at once. Meanwhile, confusion spread through Antony's lines. Then a dramatic and controversial moment occurred. In the midst of the battle, Cleopatra's fleet, positioned behind Antony's ships, suddenly turned and sailed southward, breaking away from the fighting. Ancient historians have debated this moment for centuries. Some claimed Cleopatra panicked and fled the battlefield. Others argued that the retreat had been planned in advance as part of the strategy to escape toward Egypt. Whatever the exact reason, Antony soon made a shocking decision. Seeing Cleopatra's ship sailing away, he left the battle and followed her. Taking a small number of ships with him, Antony abandoned much of his fleet and sailed after the Egyptian queen. For the thousands of soldiers still fighting under his command, the consequences were devastating. Leaderless and surrounded, Antony's remaining ships continued battling as best they could, but the advantage now belonged entirely to Octavian. By the end of the day, Octavian's forces had destroyed or captured much of Antony's fleet. The Battle of Actium was over. It had become one of the most decisive naval battles in ancient history. Antony and Cleopatra managed to escape with a small group of ships and eventually reached Egypt, but their military power had been shattered. Octavian now controlled the seas and possessed overwhelming strength. The defeat at Actium marked the beginning of the end for both Antony and Cleopatra. Across the Roman world, allies began abandoning Antony's cause. Provinces and commanders switched their loyalty to Octavian, recognizing that the balance of power had shifted. Octavian himself did not immediately pursue them. Instead, he spent the following months securing the territories that had once supported Antony. But the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Soon Octavian would march toward Egypt itself. In the city of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony prepared for their final stand. The last chapter of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the final days of Egypt's independence were about to unfold. Chapter 10. The Fall of Alexandria and the Death of Cleopatra. 31 BCE to 30 BCE. After the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, the once powerful alliance between Cleopatra's Philopator and Mark Antony began to collapse. The battle had shattered their naval strength and destroyed the confidence of many of their allies. Though Antony and Cleopatra had managed to escape the battlefield with a small fleet and sail back to Egypt, the consequences of their defeat were severe. The Mediterranean world quickly recognized that the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of Augustus. Across the eastern provinces, governors and military commanders began abandoning Antony's cause. Cities that had once supported him declared loyalty to Octavian instead. Kingdoms that had been allied with Cleopatra quietly changed their position. By the time Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria, they were facing the grim reality that their empire was rapidly disappearing. Yet Cleopatra refused to surrender immediately. The queen had spent her entire life navigating political danger. She had survived exile, civil war, and the complex struggles of Roman politics. Even now, with Octavian's power growing stronger every day, she searched for ways to preserve her kingdom. Cleopatra began strengthening Alexandria's defenses and preparing for the possibility of a final confrontation. Meanwhile, Antony struggled with the psychological weight of defeat. For years, he had been one of Rome's most powerful generals. Now many of his former supporters had deserted him. His reputation in the Roman world had been shattered by Octavian's propaganda and by the disastrous outcome at Actium. Still, Antony attempted to rebuild his forces. He gathered what soldiers and ships remained loyal to him and prepared for the inevitable Roman invasion. But the reality was clear. The resources available to Antony and Cleopatra were far smaller than those commanded by Octavian. During this tense period, Cleopatra also began considering a different strategy. She attempted to open negotiations with Octavian. If she could reach an agreement, perhaps Egypt might survive as a client kingdom under Roman influence. Cleopatra even explored the possibility of sending her son, Ptolemy XV Caesar, away from Egypt to ensure his safety. Caesarion held special significance. Cleopatra had long promoted him as the true son and heir of Julius Caesar. But that claim represented a serious threat to Octavian's political position. Octavian's own authority in Rome rested partly on his status as Caesar's adopted heir. As long as Caesarion lived, that claim might be challenged. For Cleopatra, protecting her son became an urgent priority. While these political maneuvers unfolded, Octavian steadily prepared for his final campaign. In 30 BCE, Roman forces began moving toward Egypt. Octavian's armies advanced across the eastern Mediterranean with little resistance. Most of Antony's remaining allies had already switched sides. When the Roman forces approached Egypt, Antony attempted one final military effort. At first, there were small successes. Some of Octavian's cavalry units were temporarily repelled by Antony's forces near Alexandria. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the defenders might delay the Roman advance. But the advantage was short-lived. Many of Antony's soldiers soon deserted, recognizing that Octavian's victory was inevitable. Without sufficient troops or reliable commanders, Antony's position became hopeless. As the Roman army closed in on Alexandria, panic and confusion spread throughout the city. Within the royal palace, Cleopatra began preparing for the possibility that the end was near. She ordered the construction of a monument or mausoleum where she could retreat if the city fell. The building was designed to protect her treasures and serve as a final refuge. Meanwhile, Antony faced a devastating emotional blow. False rumors reached him claiming that Cleopatra had taken her own life inside the mausoleum. Believing the queen he loved was dead and seeing no hope for victory, Antony made a tragic decision. He chose to end his own life. According to ancient accounts, Antony fell upon his sword, attempting suicide in the traditional Roman manner. The wound, however, did not kill him immediately. Soon afterward, word reached Cleopatra that Antony had injured himself. She ordered her attendants to bring him to the mausoleum where she had taken shelter. Because the entrance had been sealed for protection, Antony had to be lifted through a window into the building. Inside the dim chamber filled with royal treasures, Cleopatra and her attendants watched as Antony slowly died from his wounds. Ancient writers describe a final emotional meeting between the two. Antony reportedly urged Cleopatra to seek honorable terms from Octavian and advised her to trust one of Octavian's officers. Shortly afterward, the once great Roman general died. His death marked the end of one of the most dramatic political careers of the Roman Republic. But Cleopatra's fate was still uncertain. Octavian soon captured Alexandria. Roman troops entered the city and secured the palace district. Cleopatra herself was taken into custody. Octavian treated her carefully. He understood that Cleopatra was one of the most famous rulers in the world. If he brought her back to Rome alive, she could be displayed as a captive during his triumphal celebrations. Such a spectacle would demonstrate his victory over both Antony and Egypt. Cleopatra quickly realized this possibility. The idea of being paraded through the streets of Rome as a defeated queen was unbearable to her. Throughout her life, she had ruled as a monarch, presenting herself as a divine figure linked to the goddess Isis. To be humiliated before a Roman crowd would destroy everything she had built. In the days that followed, Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian. But she also prepared for another outcome. In August of 30 BCE, Cleopatra requested permission to visit Antony's tomb. After performing the traditional rituals of mourning, she returned to her chamber with 2 loyal attendants. What happened next soon became one of the most famous mysteries in ancient history. Ancient sources report that Cleopatra arranged to end her life rather than face captivity. The most famous story claims that she allowed herself to be bitten by a venomous snake, often described as an Egyptian cobra or asp. Other accounts suggest she may have used poison concealed in a small container. The exact method remains uncertain. What is known is that Cleopatra died shortly afterward at the age of 39. Her attendants also took their own lives beside her. When Octavian's guards finally entered the chamber, they found the queen already dead. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. For nearly 3 centuries, the descendants of Alexander's general Ptolemy, one Soter, had ruled Egypt. Now their kingdom was gone. Octavian ordered that Cleopatra and Antony be buried together in Alexandria. But he also made another decision that would shape the future of Egypt. Caesarion was captured soon afterward. Because of the political danger posed by a living son of Julius Caesar, Octavian ordered the young king's execution. With Caesarion's death, no direct heir of Cleopatra remained. Egypt itself was transformed into a Roman province. The ancient kingdom that had once been ruled by pharaohs for thousands of years now became part of the expanding Roman Empire. Yet Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. In the centuries that followed, poets, historians, and artists would transform her life into legend. She would be remembered not only as the last queen of Egypt, but as one of the most fascinating figures in all of history. And the legacy of her life would continue long after the fall of her kingdom. Chapter 11. The Legacy of Cleopatra and the End of an Era. 30 BCE and after. When Cleopatra VII Philopator died in 30 BCE, an entire age of history came to an end. Her death did not simply mark the fall of a queen. It marked the final collapse of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and the disappearance of the last independent Hellenistic kingdom born from the conquests of Alexander the Great. The world that Cleopatra had known was changing rapidly. For generations after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his former generals had ruled vast kingdoms stretching from Greece to India. Among them was Ptolemy I Soter, who established his rule in Egypt and created one of the richest and most powerful states of the ancient world. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a center of culture, commerce, and learning. The great city of Alexandria grew into one of the most famous cities in the Mediterranean. Its harbor welcomed ships from every corner of the known world, and its scholars gathered knowledge from countless cultures. The city was home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, which housed an enormous collection of scrolls and served as a meeting place for philosophers, scientists, and writers. For centuries, the Ptolemies maintained control over Egypt through a mixture of Greek political traditions and ancient Egyptian religious customs. The rulers presented themselves as pharaohs, participating in traditional ceremonies and honoring the Egyptian gods. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, however, the Ptolemaic kingdom was no longer the dominant power it had once been. Rome had risen to become the greatest political and military force in the Mediterranean. The Roman Republic had expanded steadily across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, absorbing or dominating the territories that once belonged to Alexander's successors. Cleopatra's reign had been shaped by this reality. Throughout her life, she had attempted to protect Egypt's independence by forming alliances with powerful Roman leaders. Her relationship with Julius Caesar had restored her to the throne and strengthened Egypt's political position. Later, her partnership with Mark Antony had allowed Egypt to remain a major power in the eastern Mediterranean. But after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra by Augustus, the balance of power shifted permanently. Octavian's victory ended the long period of civil wars that had torn the Roman Republic apart. When he returned to Rome after conquering Egypt, he became the undisputed master of the Roman world. In 27 BCE, the Roman Senate granted him the title Augustus, marking the beginning of a new political system that historians now call the Roman Empire. Egypt became one of the most important provinces of this new empire. Unlike many other territories, Egypt was not governed by a traditional Roman senator. Instead, Augustus placed it under the direct authority of the emperor. Roman governors known as prefects ruled the land on his behalf. This arrangement reflected Egypt's immense strategic value. The fertile lands along the Nile produced enormous quantities of grain. These shipments became essential for feeding the population of Rome, which by this time had grown into one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Control of Egypt, therefore, meant control of a vital economic resource. Roman soldiers were stationed across the province to maintain order and protect the grain supply. Alexandria remained an important port and cultural center, but it was now firmly integrated into the Roman imperial system. Although Cleopatra's kingdom had disappeared, many aspects of Egyptian culture continued to thrive. Temples still honored ancient gods such as Isis and Osiris. Religious traditions that had existed for thousands of years continued under Roman rule. At the same time, the blending of Greek and Egyptian cultures that had developed during the Ptolemaic period continued to influence life in Egypt. Cleopatra herself soon became a legendary figure. Roman writers, many of whom supported Augustus, often portrayed her as a dangerous and seductive queen who had manipulated powerful men. In their stories, she appeared as a symbol of Eastern luxury and corruption. This portrayal helped justify Augustus's victory by presenting his war against Cleopatra as a struggle to protect Roman values. Yet other traditions remembered Cleopatra very differently. Some historians described her as an intelligent and capable ruler who spoke multiple languages and possessed remarkable political skill. Ancient accounts suggest she was highly educated and deeply familiar with philosophy, science, and diplomacy. Modern historians generally agree that Cleopatra was far more than the romantic figure depicted in Roman propaganda. She was a determined and strategic monarch who ruled during one of the most turbulent periods in Mediterranean history. Her greatest challenge had been preserving Egypt's independence at a time when Rome was steadily absorbing the kingdoms around it. For nearly 2 decades, she succeeded in maintaining her power and protecting her country's position in the region. Even her final decision to take her own life, rather than face humiliation in Rome, reflected the mindset of a ruler determined to control her destiny. Over the centuries, Cleopatra's life inspired countless works of literature, art, and drama. Writers in the Roman world described her story in vivid detail. Centuries later, poets and playwrights continued retelling the dramatic tale of her relationships with Caesar and Antony. One of the most famous interpretations appeared in the play Antony and Cleopatra, written by William Shakespeare in the early 17th century. In modern times, Cleopatra's story has appeared in novels, paintings, films, and documentaries. She remains one of the most recognizable figures of the ancient world. Yet behind the legend stands a real historical figure. Cleopatra was a ruler navigating the dangerous politics of the late Roman Republic. She governed a wealthy but vulnerable kingdom, while powerful Roman leaders fought for control of the Mediterranean. Her life intersected with some of the most influential individuals in ancient history. Through her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she became directly involved in the political struggles that eventually transformed the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. When she died in 30 BCE, the political map of the Mediterranean changed forever. Egypt's independence ended, the last Hellenistic kingdom disappeared, and Rome emerged as the dominant power of the ancient world. The story of Cleopatra, therefore, represents more than the life of a queen. It marks the dramatic conclusion of the age of Alexander and the beginning of a new era dominated by Rome. Her life, her ambitions, and her final tragic decision ensured that her name would echo across history. More than 2,000 years later, the legend of Cleopatra still endures. Chapter 12. Cleopatra in Memory, Myth, and History. After 30 BCE to the modern A. After the death of Cleopatra VII Philopator in 30 BCE, the political story of her reign came to an end. Yet the story of her reputation had only just begun. In many ways, Cleopatra's legacy would become as powerful as her life itself. The rulers who emerged victorious from the Roman civil wars had a strong interest in shaping how history remembered her. The new master of the Roman world, Augustus, had defeated both Cleopatra and Mark Antony in the struggle for power. To strengthen his own political position, Augustus needed the war to appear not as a conflict between Romans, but as a heroic victory over a dangerous foreign queen. Roman writers and historians soon began presenting Cleopatra through this political lens. Many accounts described her as a seductive ruler who had used charm and manipulation to control powerful Roman leaders. In these stories, Antony appeared as a tragic figure who had abandoned Roman discipline and fallen under the influence of an Eastern monarch. These narratives helped justify the transformation of the Roman Republic into the new imperial system created by Augustus. By portraying Cleopatra as a threat to Roman order, Roman authors reinforced the idea that Augustus had saved Rome from foreign domination. Among the writers who described Cleopatra's life were historians such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio. Their works remain some of the most important sources for the events surrounding Cleopatra's reign. Yet these writers lived long after the events they described, and they often relied on Roman traditions shaped by political propaganda. As a result, modern historians must read their accounts carefully, recognizing that they reflect both historical memory and Roman political attitudes. Despite these biases, the ancient stories preserved vivid images of Cleopatra's personality. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra's greatest strength was not simply physical beauty, but her intelligence and presence. He wrote that her conversation was captivating, and that she possessed an extraordinary ability to adapt to different cultures and languages. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra spoke several languages fluently and could communicate directly with many of the different peoples living within her kingdom. This was unusual among the Ptolemaic rulers, who often relied on translators when dealing with Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra's education also reflected the cultural environment of Alexandria. For centuries, the city had served as one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Scholars associated with the famous Library of Alexandria studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and philosophy. Growing up in this environment, Cleopatra likely received a sophisticated education in Greek culture, science, and politics. This intellectual background may have helped her navigate the complex diplomacy of the late Roman Republic. After Egypt became a Roman province, Cleopatra's story continued circulating throughout the Mediterranean. Roman poets and dramatists turned the dramatic events of her life into powerful literary themes. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony became symbols of passion, ambition, and tragedy. In Roman literature, Cleopatra often appeared as the embodiment of luxury and emotional intensity, contrasting with the discipline and restraint that Roman authors associated with their own culture. These literary traditions shaped how later generations understood her character. Centuries later, during the Renaissance in Europe, scholars rediscovered many classical texts describing the ancient world. Cleopatra's dramatic story quickly captured the imagination of writers and artists. One of the most influential portrayals appeared in the play Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare. Written in the early 17th century, the play presented Cleopatra as a complex and powerful personality. Shakespeare's version emphasized her intelligence, emotional depth, and dramatic relationship with Antony. Through this work and others, Cleopatra became one of the most famous female characters in world literature. During the 19th and 20th centuries, Cleopatra's story expanded even further through paintings, novels, and eventually film. Artists often depicted her surrounded by the exotic imagery of ancient Egypt, golden palaces, temple columns, and the flowing waters of the Nile. Some portrayals focused on her beauty and romance, while others emphasized her political ambition and determination. One of the most famous cinematic interpretations appeared in the film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor as the Egyptian queen. The film dramatized Cleopatra's relationships with Caesar and Antony, and introduced her story to a new global audience. Yet modern historical research has gradually begun separating legend from reality. Archaeologists and historians studying the Ptolemaic period have developed a more nuanced understanding of Cleopatra's reign. Rather than viewing her simply as a romantic figure, scholars increasingly emphasize her role as a political strategist and monarch. Cleopatra ruled during one of the most unstable periods in Mediterranean history. The Roman Republic was collapsing under the pressure of internal conflict, while powerful generals competed for dominance. Within this dangerous environment, Cleopatra attempted to protect Egypt's independence and preserve the stability of her kingdom. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony were not merely personal relationships. They were also calculated political partnerships designed to maintain Egypt's position within the shifting power structure of the Roman world. For nearly 2 decades, these strategies allowed Egypt to remain independent despite Rome's expanding influence. Cleopatra's final defeat did not occur because of personal weakness, but because Rome had become too powerful for any single kingdom to resist. After her death, Egypt remained an essential part of the Roman Empire for centuries. The grain harvested along the Nile continued feeding the growing population of Rome, while Alexandria remained a vibrant center of culture and trade. Even as political power shifted, the cultural blending of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman traditions continued shaping life in the region. Today, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognizable figures of the ancient world. Her life sits at the intersection of several great historical transformations: the end of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the fall of the Roman Republic, and the rise of the Roman Empire. Her story also reflects the complexities of leadership in an age dominated by powerful empires. Cleopatra was not merely a queen caught in the tides of history. She was an active participant in one of the most dramatic political struggles of the ancient Mediterranean. More than 2,000 years after her death, historians still debate the details of her life and the decisions she made. But one fact remains clear. The name Cleopatra continues to symbolize power, intelligence, ambition, and tragedy. And through history, legend, and art, the voice of Egypt's last queen continues to echo across the centuries.